Jeff, it's great to see you. Thanks for participating today.
Thanks, Norm. Appreciate the invitation. Hope all's going well for you.
No, we're good. And, it's for me, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You always, I don't know, you always have a glint in your eye and you always put me in a positive mood. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Appreciate that.
So listen, give us a bit of your background. You're one of the world's foremost airport experts, but you have a tremendous amount of experience. Tell us a little bit about your career. You just mentioned that you've moved 26 times in the 52 years of your marriage, and so you got married when you were 11 years old.
I
And
wish.
and you were a colonel in the Marine Corps as well. So just tell us a little bit about your background, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. Well, my working career started in 1968, fall of 68. I entered the Marines. I was a young officer, and I spent the next 27 years doing what Marine infantry officers do. A lot of deployments, a lot of interesting assignments in places like Korea. I was a defense attaché in the Caribbean. My last campaign was the campaign in Mogadishu in 1992, December 9th. You probably watched us land on the beach that day, and I was the colonel that had to answer all the questions from the press, and it was a pretty amazing experience. But yeah, so that career, that 27 career ended when I retired from the Marine Corps in 1995, and then I started my second career. And basically, it's been around aviation space, particularly around airports and privatizing and operating airports. So I joined Airport Group International as my second assignment out of the Marine Corps. And we were really pioneers. That company was the first company, U.S. company, to really go after the airport asset market that was growing at the time in Latin America and in Asia in particular. So my first assignment was in Australia, and while there, in that short period of time, we privatized 5 airports. Actually, AGI had 6 airports. We were very successful there in a very short period of time. And then from there, I moved back to California, where Airport Group International was headquarters. And over the next 3 or 4 years, we privatized San Jose, Costa Rica, the 3 airports in Bolivia, worked on the privatization of London Luton, which we were successful in some other airports, basically around the globe. But my focus was on Latin America because I lived in Latin America prior to that and speak Spanish. So that was really my focus. So yeah, Airport Group International got sold in 2000, and I moved to become the Chief Operating Officer and subsequently the Chief Executive Officer of Colliers International, very large commercial real estate company headquartered in California. And I still was very much involved in airports because we were the first commercial real estate company to actually get involved in the disposition of Air Force bases and other air bases that the military was disposing of under the BRAC, which is the Base Closure Act. So we had a lot of time looking at different, trying to figure out how you take a former military air base and all it meant to the community and translate that into something that might be an airport or might not be an airport. And how do you make that evaluation? How do you position that particular airport to be whatever it's going to be and actually put it on the market? So we were very excited about that. And we also formed a practice group that put together a bunch of professionals around the Colliers global platform that looked at and specialized in dealing with and helping developers and operators related to airport land on the airport or airport land around the airport. So through defense operators, and that was a very, very interesting deal as well. We sold to Colliers International. LA was sold in 2005, and I then went to work for DynCorp International for about 1.5 years, a big military contractor, a government contractor worth a couple $2 billion, headquartered in Texas, and moved to Texas with that assignment and became their senior vice president of commercial operations, which was levering all their global footprint from these big government contracts into commercial contracts. And that was really an exciting assignment. I worked on the Belgrade cargo development there with DynCorp, was in charge of that from a management standpoint, as well as we developed and opened an airport in Kwaibom in Nigeria, in Uyo, Nigeria. And so the state of Akwa Ibom, really quite an exciting venture. It was just a batch of bare ground, and the governor had a vision. And so we undertook to develop that. So I never really got out of the airport business. And then I was recruited to join HAS Development Corporation, which was the development arm of the Houston Airport System, as the chief executive, and find ways for them to expand the Houston Airport System's expertise and aviation presence in markets overseas. And that company morphed into ADC HAS, which was a joint venture between Airport Development Corporation, owned and operated by Michael Wong, who developed the T3 Toronto terminal that I'd become familiar with and we were part of in some ways way back in the 90s as well. And then that became Airports Worldwide when OMERS came in as the majority owner. And then OMERS decided not to grow the airport market anymore. But 5 years that we were there, we had ownership positions in Costa Rica, and Venezuela, and Liberia, Costa Rica, San Jose and Liberia both, in Skavsta, Sweden, Belfast International, and Sanford, Florida, the only real concession in the US at the time. So we had 5 airports and about 35 million passengers and 11 operating contracts in our portfolio at the end of that 5 years. And at that point, I and a few of the executives from AWW joined CCR in their effort to internationalize, and their first effort at that was to open the office here in Houston in 2015. So it's been about 25 years, I guess, focused on airport acquisitions, airport development, and airport operations and financing.
You're a lucky guy. Two whole careers. At the end, I'll ask you what you're going to do in your third career, but no reason to get ahead of ourselves. Listen, most people aren't familiar with CCR Global. Can you talk a little bit about CCR, who they are and what they do, and what you're doing in the U.S.?
Perfect. CCR is about 25 years old. It's a publicly traded transportation infrastructure company. It's headquartered in Sao Paulo. It has about 19,000 direct employees, about 35,000 if you include indirect employees. And basically, we acquire and operate and develop transportation infrastructure assets across 3 classes of infrastructure. The company really started as a toll road developer and operator. That's really its bread and butter, and it today I think is the largest or one of the top 3 toll road operators in the world in terms of how many kilometers of road they operate and how much has been invested in those roads. Just about every major highway in Brazil is probably in one way or another a CCR road. The other class of infrastructure.
They have a really great reputation.
Yeah, that's how we started, was in toll roads. We actually created that market and the concession market in Brazil. That was CCR's beginning. We also are in the urban mobility space as well, where we operate rail, light rail, subways, and even ferries. And if you watched the Olympics in Rio, you saw all those passengers being delivered by ferries, connecting by subway to get to the venue for the Olympics. That was almost all CCR transportation assets. So that's another one of our 3 groups. And finally, airports. And the airports, we have 4 airports in our portfolio, all capital cities. Quito, Ecuador, we actually developed, built, and opened that greenfield airport in 2013. And it's a long-term concession. We're really happy with that. San Jose, Costa Rica, Curacao, the international airport there, and finally Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, a very large industrial and dairy state. Altogether about 25, 30 million passengers a year. And if you look at those transportation assets, pre-COVID, of course, CCR typically moved about 1.7 to 1.8 million passengers a day across those assets. But we are a long-term balance sheet operator, Norm. We don't have an exit on a contract. Our exit is the end of the contract, and when we can, we extend it. our DNA is in operations. We have a technology company has about 600 engineers and an IT company with about 400 people. And we also have something very unique to the U.S. market, which is becoming more important here. We have an institute, has 108 full-time employees led by a senior executive. And its whole mission is to make sure that all of our projects meet all contractual and CCR, social responsibility, ESG, sustainability goals. That's in our DNA. It's a very, very important part of the way we do business. And that's one of the unique features that we actually bring to the States. So we're a long-term investor. We can wait a long time to get our returns and therefore spend a lot of time working on developing these assets to their fullest capability.
That's how you have to invest in infrastructure from the private sector side. It seems to me, you know, most people, you and I have often talked about private investment in infrastructure, especially airport infrastructure. You've been very generous with your time. Is there one thing that the federal government can do in the U.S. To efficiently open up the airport sector?
Well, you know, the U.S. airport sector is really unique, Norm. It's unique, unlike other parts of the world where airports have largely been privatized. You know, in this hemisphere, if you look south of the Mexican border, is about 108, I think, maybe more airports that have been privatized. So privatization is nothing new in this hemisphere. In the UK and Europe, a lot of privatized airports. In Asia, for example, Australia, most of the airports, all the airports in Australia have been privatized. So while privatization is not uncommon, it is here in the U.S. for a couple of reasons. Traditionally, U.S. airports have had really inexpensive funding, you know, through public activity bonds to be able to carry out the capex they need. And secondly, because of the unique ownership structure in the U.S. market. Unlike, for example, Brazil, when they made the decision to privatize their airports, there was a single state-owned operator. That decision was made, and there was a national program, international RFP process that was conducted by the government. So one decision maker, one clear decision, once made, it was going to happen. And the same with the rest of the world. In other words, all the airports in the rest of the world basically came out of federal government ownership. So once that decision and the structure was decided upon on how to privatize the airports, it moved forward very quickly. Here in the U.S., airports are owned by local communities, counties, commissions, all different sorts of ownership. So every deal is a boutique deal. And while the FAA regulates airports and oversees their safety and makes sure that we have adequate runways, et cetera, they don't own the airports. So it's difficult. There is no national policy, therefore, for the privatization of airports. There is, of course, you know, the FAA program, which, by the way, we're happy to see has made some significant changes in the past few years. That actually is encouraging because it's provided ways, new ways for the airport ownership in the U.S. to have the private sector involved in a privatization or not mode. It's also provided funding for smaller airports, especially who don't have the resources and money to conduct a feasibility study to decide if they want to be on the program or not. But I think that for you know, for the U.S. You know, there's still some sticking points, is that ultimately the FAA has to prove the privatization. So if you're an investor and you're looking, let's say we move forward with a St. Louis, for example, and you're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of resources putting together an RFP. It's going to take a year or so to process that. It's going to take probably 2 years on average before the concession contract or the transfer of the ownership is effected. And at one point, very late in the process, when you have your business plan and your financing plan ready and your operations plan, the FAA has to approve it or not. So, you know, the question mark for an investor operator or consortiums is, you know, do we want to go down that road and put the decision at the end at risk? You know, there's really no guarantee. And so what happens, not by intent, by any stretch of the imagination, because folks in the FAA are now, I think, if not totally agnostic, at least, you know, maybe even encouraging private involvement in airports. But the default is that they become the de facto owner. So you have to deal with the FAA, who's going to evaluate your business plan to privatize the airport and present to an owner, for consideration for sale or transfer of ownership. How does that happen?
Right.
I mean, how do they make the evaluation about your business plan?
Right.
They know how to forecast, of course they do, but we forecast differently. If you're looking at a private operator, investor, you don't just do a GDP based forecast, you do that. But then you add to that forecast all your industry relationships, your successes, your strength, your operating base, relations with airlines, all your experience in air service development from a global basis. And you
Right.
make that airport perform above that sort of what I would call vanilla kind of GDP forecast. So it becomes very, very tricky when you're talking about the kind of money it takes to undertake a process like that. And the final decision is in the hands of not the owner, but the federal government.
Interesting. So it's still a heavy lift no matter what happens.
Well, for a lot of reasons, but we were talking specifically about that portion of it, and the FAA has to approve what airports, enter into a privatization program. Now, granted, one of the things we're really encouraged about is they provided a $750,000 grant for help now, but who's the owner? I mean, when you start to develop a deal, you have an idea, or you see an airport or a city you'd like to get involved with on a long-term basis as an investor operator, who do you start talking to? Is it the FAA? Is it the owner? Is it the city? So it's a very, very confusing roadmap to actually get to a successful process, as we've seen, unfortunately, in recent years with some failures here in the U.S.
You bet. Well, that's super interesting. Obviously, you're a tough guy for persisting as well. One of the things you mentioned last time when we spoke is the focus as well on logistics, airport logistics. I don't want to ask you anything that's confidential, but what can you tell us about what you're looking at, what you're seeing in the logistics space? Because that clearly hasn't suffered nearly as much as the passenger space.
Well, at least not now. So when CCR first opened its office here in Houston, we almost immediately acquired a company called Total Airport Services. Total Airport Services is an airport services company. It primarily does cargo warehousing and cargo handling, but lately in the last 5 years, it's grown to almost 50-50 now, below wing handling at all major airports. So we handle as it relates to logistics, we handle virtually all of the top 15 air cargo airline operators in the world, and we handle them at the major airports here in the U.S. Where TAS operates today is in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Chicago, George Bush, Atlanta, Bradley, and others, 8 major airports. And so we came then, as we looked at that company and we learned to look at it, we learned the difference between the way airports do cargo operations here and overseas, which is where we have a lot of experience also.
Okay.
Overseas, the airport operator is very directly involved in cargo operations. So they'll often build the building as we did, and they'll often operate the building. Here, cargo operations have been largely in the real estate department of airports. It's just a real estate deal. They do a ground lease. Some developer builds a cargo facility. They get airlines to sign up to lease that space and operate there, or you lease the space and operate there, and you go shopping for airlines to operate out of your building. So as a result, there hasn't been a lot of focus on cargo operations at U.S. airports, and the infrastructure is. We became familiar with it with our TAS operations now going on over 5 years. We saw it was antiquated and inadequate to meet demand in many of the major hub airports, and antiquated in the sense that you still have these U designs and other things that were developed for aircraft that don't exist anymore, don't fly anymore. So then you look at it, typically overseas airports will have, it'll be a significant portion of the revenues. But here what we find, especially in these big, large land-constrained airports, is sort of an anomaly, because you'll see that 35 or 40% of the operating AOA area of the airport, the operating, the heart of the airport, that land only generates about 7 or 8% from revenues, cargo operations. So very inefficient operations in a lot of ways. So we've been focusing a lot on that. And of course, COVID I think illustrated some of the real shortfalls that we have in the U.S. as it relates to not only the model that cargo operators have traditionally used in the U.S. and the way airports have viewed cargo operations, but also the facilities themselves and new levels of sustainability. We're thinking about basically, we've been working real hard with some other major institutional investors that are well known to develop a whole new class of infrastructure related to sustainability.
No, that's great. I think we're going to have the well-known investor. I think they're going to participate in our upcoming North American Leadership Forum next Thursday, October 28th. So we'll take off the wraps on that secret deal.
There you go.
One last question, Jeff. I've always been impressed by the way you treat people. You treat people really fantastically well. What's the key to building a great unit or a great initiative in terms of how you treat your people?
Wow, that's a big question. I think, Norm, that what I learned as a young Marine is that there's leadership and then there's officership. And if you go to the bookstore today, there's legions of books on leadership. I don't think I've ever seen one written about officership. But officership and leadership are two different things altogether. And you can be a great leader and be negative. Mussolini was a great leader. Hitler was a great leader. He inspired people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. But he was kind of a negative guy, wasn't he? Yeah, leadership happens at all levels in the organization. You could have leaders from the youngest kid in an organization to the top ranks of the organization. Officership only happens at a certain level in an organization. And that's another difference. Leadership takes two. You can't lead unless there's somebody else with you to lead or to be led by. Right. Officership happens when nobody is looking and you're all alone. It happens 24/7. So I think in my mind, what we're lacking in the country today, I see it a lot, is that there's just sort of a lack of officership. And that's how really bad things happen in corporate boardrooms and corporate decisions are made. I think that you just simply recognize that, being the guy in the corner office with the title CEO is not much. It's just a title. Somebody's got to do the job. And I really also always hold to what I tell the guys in our teams is, every organization has an organization diagram. There's boxes, and the box has a label, operations, logistics, whatever it may be. And what I really try to do is create a team and an organization where the magic happens in the white spaces between the boxes on the organization diagram. Yeah, and I think that's critical in today's environment. If you operate in a traditional way, you're just not going to maximize the talent that you have to maximize when you bring your people on your team. If you don't let them play, you're wasting their time and your time and money as well. So that's, and you just treat people with the same way you want, just fundamental respect.
That's great. I really appreciate it, Jeff. Listen, thanks so much for your time and thanks so much for your friendship. For me, it's always a pleasure working with you guys and talking to you guys as well. So thanks so much.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity, Norm. Hopefully we'll get up to your part of the country and to be able to have a beer.
That'd be great. Look forward to that. Thank you very much, Jeff. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Thanks.